I am Alexandre Mouradian, founder of the Spinoza Foundation. At Spinoza Foundation, we bring people together to find solutions to the problem of our days. Today, I'm welcoming acclaimed author of The Great Influenza, John Barry. The story of the deadliest pandemic in history, the 1918 pandemic. So John, as European governments are back into lockdown, how do you see the second wave playing in comparison to the second wave of the Great Influenza of 1918?
Fortunately, bad as this may be, what we're facing now, it's nothing like the second wave in 1918. The 1918 virus was vastly more virulent. To give you a sense, it killed between 50 and 100 million people. Adjusted for population, that would be the equivalent to about 220 to 440 million people today. So we're not facing anything like that. And of course, in 1918, most of Europe and the United States was at war. So that affected the course of events as well. So I don't really think that you can draw a lot of parallels between that wave and what we're facing now. And for another thing, it was a true wave in 1918. Now it's a little bit different. We can control through, quote, non-pharmaceutical interventions, unquote, i.e., what do you do when you don't have any drugs? We have learned that we can exercise quite a bit of control over the course of the disease using these interventions. The question is what the cost is of these interventions on society, and closing things down and so forth, and how much resistance there is to them, how much compliance there will be. Those things are very difficult to predict. Perhaps the biggest difference, among them, is the mutation rate. The 1918 virus changed, I think, radically. The first wave in 1918 was not widespread around the world. There are a lot of places that were missed entirely. And it also was not at all virulent, no worse than seasonal influenza. Something happened. And in the first widespread outbreak of a lethal form of influenza was in Switzerland in July. And that second wave did spread everywhere. And I mean everywhere in the world. Jungles, villages in Africa, Eskimo villages in Alaska. And it was lethal, highly virulent. In this case, so my speculation is, in fact, those two waves were so different that there is a minority view of virologists who think that they were actually different viruses. I don't think that makes sense. Somebody wants to know why, I could go into all the reasons why I think the evidence is compelling that we're the same virus. But it did sort of mutate. I think probably it wasn't great at infecting people in the first wave. That's why it was hit or miss. And it acquired that ability in addition to increased in virulence. This virus does not mutate nearly as rapidly as influenza. It's been quite stable. It may have acquired an ability to transmit a little bit more efficiently. That's not entirely clear. But it is clear this virus was born ready to infect humans. Obviously spread worldwide very, very rapidly. There has been no indication anywhere of a change in its virulence. Fortunately, we have learned to care for patients a lot better than we did when this first hit. think the big question, of course, now is what to do. 40,000 cases a day in France. That's an extraordinary number. The U.S. cracked 80,000, and I think we're on our way to cracking 100,000 and possibly a lot more. Morgan Stanley had a model that several months ago predicted the U.S. would face 150,000 cases a day if policy and behavior didn't change. Predicting the virus is one thing. Predicting human behavior is another. The virus is much easier to predict.
Is there a chance that this disease become endemic and will turn into like a killer version of the flu every year, with infecting 10 or 20% of the population every year?
Well, I think it will become endemic. Number one, it's widely disseminated through the human population. Number two, it has animal reservoirs. It can infect other mammals. So even if somehow we were going to exterminate it from humans, there are some countries where they've come close to doing that. It's going to come back. You can't exterminate it from the entire human population across the world. And yeah, I would expect this to be an endemic virus. The question is whether it's going to retain some of its virulence over time, or whether it's going to end up being like the coronaviruses, the common colds, which have infected humans for a long time. I know at least one respected virologist, Klaus Storr, who used to run the WHO's influenza program, who thinks that's what's going to happen. I think there are some others who think the same thing, but we don't know. Nobody knows. That's speculation. The thing this virus has the ability to bind to cells deep in the lung, which is the main reason it's dangerous. It also has the ability to bind to cells in the upper respiratory tract, which is why it's easily transmissible. SARS-1, MERS, the influenza viruses, H5N1, H7N9, and so forth, they were very dangerous because they could bind only to cells deep in the lung. So essentially, you're starting out with viral pneumonia if you're infected at all. But they could not bind to cells in the upper respiratory tract, so they were very difficult to transmit from human to human. SARS and MERS were a little bit easier, quite a bit easier than H5N1 or H7N9, but there still wasn't the airborne transmission that were in droplets and so forth that we're getting from this. But I think it's going to be around for a long time. Yeah, basically forever. I think it's a new human virus. How our immune systems respond to it over a period of time, whether the virus itself loses that ability, whether we'll be much more capable of dealing with it, that'll determine whether it remains a very serious threat or whether the threat declines to the level of a common cold.
We're starting to discover that maybe the immunity is not going to last very much, and which put also the question of the herd immunity policy.
Well, I have no special insights into that. Very informed audience. You probably read it, maybe not quite as much. I've followed this pretty closely as I have. The fact that a handful of reinfections have occurred is not disturbing. With millions of people infected, that would be expected in some cases. For example, when I was a kid, apparently I had natural immunity to smallpox. I was vaccinated multiple times. They never took, and eventually the schools which required smallpox vaccination let me in because I had doctor's notes saying I've been vaccinated X number of times. So some people will have natural immunity to any virus, and some people will be more vulnerable. By the same token, I don't think that anyone at the beginning of this was thinking that this would be lifetime immunity, such as you get for measles. You know, we still don't know how long, whether it's 6 months, whether it's a year, whether it's 3 years. We just don't know. I think the herd immunity idea, we can go into that at some length if you like. You know, I don't think it's a viable strategy as a bridge to a vaccine, although by default, some countries may end up going there. So we'll find out. And I mean, it's not going to be permanent regardless. I don't think there are really any virologists I know of, and I haven't seen any scientific papers arguing that you'd get lifelong or even really long-lasting immunity from this virus. There's certainly no evidence of that. I've already said I don't think that's a viable strategy to pursue, although, you know, if Trump is reelected, that's certainly the strategy the United States is going to pursue, whether they define it as such or not. But I can't see him doing anything further. And given the case counts in some of the European countries, they may be headed toward that strategy also as a default position. You know, I don't think it's the right strategy for a variety of reasons. Number one, just before we all signed on, you and I were talking a little bit about the neurological impacts. That you had just read a paper that a third of people have significant neurological impacts. You know, basically this virus infects every organ. Clearly has impact on the heart, clearly has impact on the central nervous system and the brain. It clearly, even asymptomatic people show damage to the heart on scans. Asymptomatic people show damage to the lungs on scans. And other organs also suffer some damage. So one thing we don't know is whether all this damage will heal or whether or not it will have long-term impacts. You know, perhaps somebody who otherwise would be healthy suffers a heart attack at, you know, age 38 or something like that. I think to knowingly go out and infect hundreds of millions of people without knowing what the long-term impacts are, but knowing that this virus does infect other organs besides the lung, I think that's foolhardy as a strategy. Then you get the question of whether or not it'll work. As a strategy, I don't think it'll work, separating the vulnerable. My understanding of Sweden is that really was not very successful. 5 times the per capita death rate of Denmark, 11 times that of Norway, and their economy actually suffered more than Denmark and Norway. My understanding is that right now, I mean, some of the problems created by the pandemic, such as people afraid to go to the doctor for cancer and miss a cancer diagnosis and stuff, things like that. That same thing is happening in Sweden. So I don't think the Swedish experiment is a successful experiment. Still remains to be seen a little bit, perhaps. So I think that the death toll would be unacceptable around the world following that strategy. And, the frustrating thing to anybody in public health is that we all know strategies that can work. They've done it in several countries, the West, other than Australia and New Zealand is sort of a special case, obviously. So maybe Australia is a better example. They have done it in Western cultures as well. We just don't seem very successful doing it in the United States. And while Europe for a while looked pretty successful, right now things are not so hot there either.
Do you think the population going to start to panic, realizing that there is actually long-term effect and it's not just a disease which you recovered, and if you are old, you might die about it?
I doubt that. That people tend not to think about future problems, which is one of the biggest problems we have. That they're not very long-term view in the general population, or for that matter, among politicians. So I don't think there will be any fear of that.
We haven't talked about a vaccine. A lot of companies are announcing that vaccines are coming soon. What's your take on those?
Nothing different from what you read in the press. The problems with Moderna, for example, Pfizer, the RNA vaccines, really is going to be a major distribution problem. The temperatures at which these things have to be stored is it's not common for drugs. Particularly when you think of the hundreds of millions of doses, there's some real logistics problems. I'm not sure how they're handling that in Europe. In the United States, the Army is probably going to play a significant role in that, but I'm not real sure about their capabilities. I think the first vaccine likely to come online that is easier on the distribution issue is Johnson & Johnson's, which is one dose, and it needs to be stored in normal refrigeration. So that is, the Moderna and Pfizer, those are 2-dose vaccines. My guess, they say that combined, Moderna and Pfizer have 100 million doses by the end of the year. Obviously, they're producing them right now in anticipation of getting an approval. The only thing I think the Trump administration did right was what they called Operation Warp Speed. But I think anyone would have done that, and you see the same speed operating in other countries around the world. I haven't really seen, in terms of the Chinese and the Russian vaccines, I haven't really seen good scientific data on that. So, and I don't know what their production capabilities are, how they plan to use them. Obviously, they gives them some diplomatic leverage. I was pleased that China finally signed on with the international consortium. The United States still has not done that. And I don't think Russia did that either, although I'm actually should be better informed on Russia's position. But the Chinese involvement in that, I think, is important in terms of distributing it around the world to countries that don't have necessarily their own capabilities. I don't know exactly where India is in the process. I know they think they're going to be doing very well. Brazil has a vaccine capability. I'm not certain exactly what stage they are. But in terms of production, I think by late first quarter next year, there will be a lot of vaccine out there. The distribution remains an issue. I think the numbers, if you look at Manaus, if I'm pronouncing the city correctly, in Brazil, a city of close to 2 million people, it looks like roughly 2/3 of the population was required to achieve herd immunity there. I've seen a paper that said 66%. That at 44%, the virus started to slow down, but it really took 66% of the population before you reach herd immunity. I know what the poll numbers say in the United States. What actually will occur, there's going to be a very significant effort to convince people to be vaccinated. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than the polls suggest. I think we'll get fairly high uptake in the United States. They'll have months of preparation to get that message out. That is not a partisan issue. Obviously, the masks became a partisan issue. So I think both sides in the United States will be urging the uptake of vaccines. So I think the numbers there will probably be pretty good. And I think it will be more of a distribution problem than a resistance problem. I might be naive on that and overly optimistic. I certainly know people who would disagree with me on that. And in terms of what's going on in the rest of the world, the anti-vaxxer movement, I'm not really that familiar with the numbers. In Europe, for example, you probably are all better informed on that than I am. I guess I could talk a little bit about the difference between 1918 and today. And we already talked about the virulence. I mean, in 1918, nobody thought it was a hoax. Western governments, the ones which were at war, lied to the population because they thought the truth would hurt their war effort and damage morale and so forth. But even with the official pronouncements mimicking what Trump has been saying, everybody took that virus seriously. It killed people. The peak years for death was 28. Roughly 2/3 of the dead were 18 to 45. So that's not really a parallel in terms of what has happened this year, particularly in the United States and maybe to a lesser extent in other countries, with the exception maybe of Brazil. Another big difference is the economic impact. I think, this virus moves much more slowly than influenza. Its incubation periods roughly 3 times as long. You shed virus longer, you're sick longer. So even if we had not, if governments had not tried to intervene in transmission, which of course slowed everything down as well, I think the economic impact would still have been more severe than 1918. But there are some things that are useful to remember about 1918, and maybe the moment in terms of the economic impact. There was a pretty steep recession, but there was a study by a member of the Federal Reserve and some academics. It came out, I think, in June, that concluded that the cities in 1918 that stayed closed the longest actually had a better economic performance coming out of the pandemic than those that were closed for a shorter period of time. I think that, again, that's important. There was also a study by University of Chicago economists, which is a general rule, that's a pretty conservative economics department, as I'm sure you're all aware, that concluded they were looking at communities that were side by side, but divided by either a county border or a state border, where in one area there was stricter regulation than there was just the other side of an arbitrary line, or maybe in some cases a river. And they concluded that only 7% of the economic decline in those areas was a result of regulation, and the rest was because human behavior was changing out of fear of contracting the disease. I think that's important to remember. Again, the Swedish economy, where, as you know, they did not close things down, had a worse second quarter than its neighbors in Scandinavia. So I don't think the answer in economic recovery, and this is another reason why I oppose herd immunity, I think you can say things are open, but that's not going to get people back. What's going to get people back is taking care of the virus. When they feel safe, they'll go to restaurants and movie theaters. When they don't feel safe, they're not going to go to either. So the idea, the main argument for herd immunity is the economy. And I don't think evidence supports the idea that just opening things up is going to bring the economy back. It's very difficult to, I don't think there was actual behavioral changes. Because of the war, it's kind of difficult to separate the change in tone in the Western world from the disillusionment following the Treaty of Versailles and obviously slaughter of millions of soldiers on both sides in one of the most pointless wars ever fought. Separating that from the pandemic is a little bit difficult. But I think that the pandemic definitely contributed to the mood of the 20s. There was someone who did a study relatively recently, and by that I mean last 10 or 20 years, who started out intending to look at the link between suicide and World War I, and concluded in the end there was no link, but that there was a link between suicide and the pandemic. Again, we're not, what we're going through is a lot different. In 1918 worldwide, 50 to 100 million dead. I really think those are the best numbers, and obviously there's a pretty wide variation. But if you adjust for population, that's equal to 220 to 440 million people today. The worst, most extreme, worst case scenarios for this virus is not a fraction of that. Well, I mean, by definition, it's a fraction, but a small fraction of that. In addition, of course, in 1918, as I was saying a minute ago, roughly 2/3 of the dead were 18 to 45. And now most of the dead are going to be elderly. So this virus is, I think, putting much greater stress on society because of the economic impact, the length of time. Another thing about 1918, the virus would move through a particular community in 6 to 10 weeks, then it would be gone. It might have come back on a third wave, it might not have. This virus is just hanging around and would hang around even if we went for herd immunity. So the mental and economic stress this time around is greater. And the duration, of course, is much greater. So, although I don't think there was any behavioral changes, in the sense, certainly people continue to shake hands after the pandemic in 1918. We may see some of that disappear. If this virus does, well, I think it will be endemic, but if it also maintains the ability to bind to cells deep in the lung. It also depends on the vaccine efficacy. If you have an 85% effective vaccine or better, then I think, people's memories are pretty short. I think we'll go back to normal. the pre-pandemic normal. And that may happen a lot faster than people think. However, most of the projections for the effectiveness of the vaccine fall short of 85%, well short. My speculation on that is really no better than yours as to what's going to happen now. But historically, you did not see the behavioral change. You did see a lot of depression. It's not clear how much of that, and again, earlier we referenced the neurological impact of this disease. The virus does get in there. It's not clear whether it's the virus directly or whether various proteins that the body releases fighting the virus, whether that's what does the damage. But in 1918, there was without a doubt widely recognized neurological damage. There was even a disease that surfaced in the 1920s, which was called encephalitis lethargica, which disappeared after a few years. And that was, widely suspected to be the last complication of the influenza virus. There was the impact of behavior because of depression and neurological damage, but in terms of customs, I don't think there was any change. This may be different. Well, as I said earlier, I think it's much easier to predict the virus than human behavior or what political decisions will be made or won't be made. Let me say there is seasonality to the virus. It does survive longer outside the body in cold temperatures and low humidity than it does in warm temperatures and high humidity. But in fact, in April, I wrote a piece in the Times predicting that summer was not going to provide relief because so much of the population at that time, probably about 95%, was still susceptible to the virus, and susceptibility was going to trump seasonality. As you get more people exposed to the virus who have immunity either from their exposure or when we start delivering vaccines to people, and assuming it's not a perfect vaccine, which I don't think it will be, then I think seasonality will probably play a bigger role than it has so far. That doesn't answer your question because I can't answer it. Again, I can't predict what kind of compliance you're going to get to any measures that are proposed. Let's say Biden wins. If Trump wins, the United States is going to have several 100,000 cases a day. I have no doubt. Well, it will depend on the case count. I think he's going to be reluctant to impose a national lockdown. He's going to, the day after the election, start talking about we're in this together, please wear a mask. I think the efficacy of masks is probably a little overstated, although I certainly think they're important. Redfield, the head of CDC in the United States, said if everybody wore a mask, we could get the pandemic under control in 6 or 8 or 10 weeks, whatever it was. I don't really think that's true. They're like levees, since I come from New Orleans, live in New Orleans, and in fact was on the levee board, the post-Katrina reform levee board, I might add. Levees are reduced risk. They don't necessarily, they protect you from some stuff, but they're just risk reduction. Masks are like that. The most important stuff you can do is social distancing, you know, no large gatherings. Well, that's a very controversial measure. And I'm actually a hawk on keeping schools open for younger kids. You know, the school closings is really a model for an influenza pandemic, or that's generated by, you know, an influenza, you know, number one, kids are vulnerable, and number two, they're super spreaders. So it makes perfect sense to close the school in an influenza pandemic or even a bad seasonal outbreak. It's much, you know, we know in this pandemic, kids tend not to be vulnerable. And there's no evidence that they're super spreaders. They may spread it like everybody else. This is, again, younger kids. When you start getting into somebody 16, 17, much less college, it's different. So the data is very, very mixed on the impact of school closings. And personally, I lean toward keeping them open. But, you know, it's amazing where 9 or 10 months into this thing, we have a tremendous amount of information, but not that much analysis. You know, everybody in the public health community continues to be astounded without really an adequate explanation as to why Africa has not been a complete disaster, which was expected and fortunately hasn't happened. Or even refugee camps were expected to be a complete disaster. And that doesn't seem to have happened yet. You know, enormous amounts of information, not clear what's going on. Yeah, I mean, obviously you're aware for a long time, there has been this idea that BCG stimulates the immune system and has a lot of spin-off benefits. Going back 25 years, more than that, there was even, you know, speculated that for cancer, BCG some of the early immunotherapies even included BCG vaccination in terms of trying to stimulate cancer immunotherapies. Although to the best of my knowledge, none of that was successful. But they tried it because BCG does seem to have other benefits, ancillary benefits.
Right. I think it was insightful. And yes, there is a last question. I think we're going to get it here and say thank you very much to John.